Hello, and welcome to MovieLabs' 2030 Vision series featuring fireside chats with leading media and entertainment voices from across our industry. My name is Richard Berger, and I'm the CEO of MovieLabs and your host. If you don't know already, MovieLabs is a nonprofit technology joint venture of the major motion picture studios, Disney, Paramount, Sony Pictures, Universal, and Warner Brothers. Today, I'm talking with Buzz Hayes, Global Lead Entertainment Industry at Google Cloud. Welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.
So I think we met at Sony Pictures, but can you give us a little bit of a background view of how you got to where you are today?
Sure. It all started when I was in high school and I worked in a drive-in movie theater, and I was sort of bitten by the movie bug. But I grew up in a little town in Maine where there wasn't really an industry to speak of. And so out of college, I ended up working for a company in Boston that did daily screening rooms for folks shooting on location. From there, I wanted to pursue the idea of production further, having met all these great professionals in the industry, working with DPs all over the place. So I ended up going to graduate school out here at USC to study film, and from there ended up as the director of engineering at Lucasfilm at THX, which brought me into a different aspect of the film business. And then I realized I really wanted to be more involved in production, so I left the very comfortable environment of working at Lucasfilm to pursue independent film. And that's what got me into film producing. And then a few years into producing, I've been doing it for about 25 years, I wanted to see more about some of the technology side of things. So I ventured into a company up in Silicon Valley called Lytro that was building light field cameras for computational imaging. And from there, we actually ended up being acquired by Google. And so I ended up at Google as a domain expert in the media and entertainment business, and realized after all this journey that my whole career had really been spent on bridging creative and technology. And that was something that wasn't by design, but it was mostly by personal interest. I've always had an interest in both sides of it. And so now at Google, I help people make their journey into cloud from the media and entertainment perspective.
It's a perfect background for your role. That's great. Mm-hmm. We published the original paper in 2019. It's been about 3 years. Do you remember sort of your first reaction when you saw that?
I do. I'm trying to remember who it was that pointed me to it. It was one of my industry professional friends, but I immediately downloaded it and didn't hesitate at the 50 plus pages to get through this thing because it was, from the get-go, it resonated with what I was doing professionally. I'd basically only recently joined Google, so this was very much in alignment with what I was doing. And my whole career has been spent in and around the film business, which is largely a standards-based organization. But it was nice to see that there was a conversation going at the studio level about how can we take this to a new place, and that doesn't happen very often. So I was very intrigued by that, and certainly very impressed.
And has it been an influence in your role at Google? Like, does it come up a lot when you're talking to customers?
It does. In fact, the funny thing is, we're a small team and we're a global team. So in a lot of cases, when an opportunity comes up to talk to a customer sales team internally about an opportunity they have, I always point them to the vision paper first and say, read this, and then we'll talk. Because I think there's a lot in there that gets them up to speed, especially if they're not as familiar with the media business. And there's so many gems in there and it's written in a way that is not overly technical to the point where people who don't fully understand the business can really understand it, which I think is great. So I point lots of people to this paper.
That's great. We're out there talking to a lot of companies like yours and throughout the industry, and we do hear that there's pretty good alignment. What do you think that alignment means for our industry and really for your role at Google? How important is that?
I think it's very important. And my mantra for the longest time has always been, whenever we have a new technology that we're trying to share with the world, it seems like everybody wants to be the second one to try it, right? And I think once people realize that there are other people trying to solve these same problems, they're not working.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's validating what they're doing. They're not in a silo anymore. They're not alone in this thinking, and it propels the migration forward in a very positive way. So I think people have suddenly realized, I'm not the only one. This is great.
Why do you think the cloud has played such a big role now? Like, why now?
Well, it's interesting because, some of this has to do with, recent times. where things had to go remote for obvious reasons. But I think
we hear the pandemic's been a catalyst for some of these use cases.
Exactly. And what's interesting is I was finding 18 months into the pandemic, people would reach out and say, could you tell me about this cloud thing you've been talking about for the last couple of years? Because they finally saw their own reason for wanting to explore the cloud. And now that we've largely become a remote workforce and largely a freelance workforce, especially in visual effects and animation and some of the more complex workflows, there's a need for finding tools that help this process. And before, people thought about cloud as more of a lift and shift. And frankly, that's my least favorite term when it comes to cloud, because lifting and shifting brings all the baggage with it. And it's not always for good that happens.
We've done that. A lot of times when there's something new, we take what we've been doing with the old technology and we just repeat it using the new medium or the new platform. Exactly. And we don't necessarily take advantage of what that new platform can unlock for us. I mean, that's part of what's behind this 2030 vision, is that it's not a lift and shift, it's a paradigm shift, really.
It's a total paradigm shift. And it's, it troubled me in the early days of trying to learn cloud and the language to be comfortable talking with other people about it. I kept hearing peers say, well, it's not your computer, it's our computer. That was their definition of cloud. I'm like, really? Is that what it is? Because I think it's more than that. If it's not a better experience in cloud for some way of more efficient, more cost effective, it's not a good reason.
I think when you start looking at it in the context of workflows and what changes when you have a resource like the cloud, then you get away from your machine, my machine, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you know this firsthand, making a movie is really complex. Workflows are constantly evolving, really. New technologies being applied. It's not easy. So one of the things that we've been doing since we published the 2030 vision paper is what we call assessing cloud readiness. And in your opinion, where do you think we are, on that journey? How close are we to this 2030 vision?
It's interesting. I think some folks are much closer to the vision than others, and it's not because of hesitation. It's because of where they come from. So, for example, companies, I work with a lot of post-production companies, visual effects companies, animation companies, who have very specific needs. And this idea, let's pick rendering as an example, is a very scalable thing. It means they don't have to own infrastructure. It's something that makes tangible sense to them right now. And they have budget to upgrade render farms so they can start to reallocate this money towards using cloud-based services and not owning the hardware. So they're very ready to step into the cloud. Where it becomes a bit more challenging, and I know they're ready, but they're not there yet, is mostly on the software side of things and the ISV side of things, and this gets into the whole security aspect of things as well. Until we get to a fully containerized world, microservices and cloud native applications, we're not going to be able to serve the entire industry with the whole mission.
It's going to take a little time, I think.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about it's not just a lift and shift, and as part of the vision, we talked about 10 principles, and the first several of them are very focused on what we call cloud foundations. The first two, in fact, all assets go straight to the cloud and need not move. That's principle one. Principle two, applications come to the media. That is that paradigm shift that I was talking about. How important do you think it is to actually realize those two principles, especially principle two?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I mean, this idea of a single source of truth is really fundamentally why I think this is important, because as a producer, I spent enormous amounts of time working with artists to make sure they had whatever tools they needed to get through a day. But invariably, you'd have artists that were just sitting there waiting for some process to happen, right? And it was often a file transfer, because I think what people outside the media business don't fully understand is when we talk about moving files around, we're not moving little tiny text files around. We're moving massive media files around that take time. And I don't know how many times I've been on the receiving end of a download from some upload download service of a massive media file only to find out it's the wrong version or there's something corrupted about it.
So now double the wait time.
Exactly. And yet we never seem to measure that wait time. And so
it was always the cost of doing business.
It was always the cost of doing business. And artists in this world of visual effects can be very expensive. And yet I think more importantly, the thing I struggled with is people are staring at progress bars. My first thought when it came to cloud was, let's eliminate the progress bars. There's a way to do that. and we can get some very easy wins in terms of efficiency. But more importantly, as a producer, the thing I would notice is, as an artist was struggling with the process, with whatever the infrastructure was doing, or that file transfer, or they had to recall a scene. We never had enough storage in any facility I worked at to keep the whole movie online. So we had to do it a sequence at a time, which meant that if you didn't plan ahead, you're waiting for things, right? So
and maybe even looking for things.
Exactly. And yeah, trying to find them. And then what I noticed was an artist would be sitting there, the progress bar would appear, and then I could sense at a certain point that their creative spark was dimming while that progress bar is there. You know, in visual effects, we have a term called CBB, which is the could be better. So as you're working through a show, you realize, yeah, there's a couple things I'd like to do to this thing, and if we have time at the end of the schedule, we'll get to it. If not, it's okay. Towards the very end of the schedule, we had a thing that we informally referred to as the CBW, which is, well, it could be worse, but it's going to end up in the movie because we don't have time to fix it. And those were all based on these inefficiencies in it. So anything we can do to keep the creative spark alive, but again, we don't measure these things. So when we should measure things. Exactly. So when we talk with customers about this idea of, you know, what does it cost you, your total cost of ownership? There's a lot of things missing in there, and not by any specific intent, but we don't measure inefficiency. So how would you be able to capture that?
Yeah, that's right. Time, we always say time is our currency here, and then if you actually you could put cost to that time that you save. You can measure the time saved.
Yep.
In the old way of doing things, and that's real metrics.
It really is. And I think as long as you can keep the artists happy, you know, I like to think of any customers we have, especially in the post-production space, are the artists. It's not the CFO, it's not the CTO, it's the artists, because they're the ones that have to get through these processes. They honestly will be the squeaky wheel when something doesn't work, right? So they need what they need when they need it. And I think that's one of the things that cloud, when done correctly, will actually offer them, this ability to just get on with their work.
So can you tell me a little bit about some of the progress that you and your partners are making and your customers in actually, you know, implementing some of these principles and moving towards that 2030 vision? Maybe some specific projects too. Yeah,
you know, we're working kind of both ends of the spectrum right now. I mean, I do a lot of work in the archive side of things, but the way I look at it, the archive starts from the minute an asset is created, not at the end of a show when the van shows up with banker boxes full of hard drives and all this stuff gets dumped into some repository. So we have to start making sense of it at the beginning. So one of the other projects we're doing with a number of the major film studios is the idea of a reuse archive, because as a producer, one of the things I always struggled with, you know, I remember this happening when I was at Sony. We'd work on a big movie like Spider-Man, and a few months later, we'd get a call from the PlayStation group saying, hey, can we use those great models you made?
For games.
And I'm like, well, you can have them, but they're not going to work because the workflow was never part of any archive. So I can give you the assets and the pieces, but it's not going to go back together. And it's worse than a jigsaw puzzle without a reference picture. There's a lot of interdependencies that are missing. So I think there's a significant interest in this idea of how can we create assets and then reuse them, which then ties into this whole idea of a digital backlot and all these other things that are very new concepts that I think people can actually embrace. So our work really covers the gamut on that side.
So it's really starting from camera into cloud and then all the way through
exactly
the life cycle.
Yeah, and I think the lines are blurring too, because you know I have a counterpart who works primarily in broadcast and live broadcast, and so we don't see a whole lot of the broadcast technology used in film, but we're starting to, because this idea, as you mentioned, of camera to cloud, you know, we don't have the immediacy need on a set where we're shooting a single camera drama, for example, to have camera to cloud, and yet if it can be more efficient for them to have those materials ready to go as that single source of truth, so an editor is working on it,
so all the downstream
then it makes sense.
Can start right away.
Yeah,
exactly. You had mentioned archive, and I know you're involved at the Academy. There's a project there on archive. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you think the benefits of archiving in the cloud are.
Sure. I mean, with the Digital Media Preservation Committee, we've been talking about, similar to the Digital Dilemma papers that were published 20 years ago, we still haven't solved this problem of digital media. And some of it is more the notion of, you know, film was a visual medium, right? If I want to know if film print is okay, I just thread it up on an editing bench and I look at it, right? Digital is a whole other kettle of fish. And I don't think we were quite ready for this idea of how this is going to happen. And again, get back to the notion that the archive starts from the minute the content's created. one of the challenges we see right now has to do in the archiving space is the shooting ratios have gone insane. I mean, back in the day,
and no one wants to get rid of any.
Exactly. If you had a director that shot a 20-to-1 ratio in film, that was considered pretty outrageous and very expensive. But you had to do circle takes. You only printed the things you circled. There were some controls on it, but it was still expensive. And now I see productions with 100, 200, 300-to-1 shooting ratios, and yet, so let's say, for example, they have a 300-to-1 shooting ratio. They haven't expanded the editorial staff to the point where they can look at all this material, right? So how are they making good choices if they can't see it all?
Right.
They still have the same deadlines. They still have the same constraints in terms of budget and other things. So one of the things we've been focusing on the archive side is really pondering this idea of we're creating far more data now than we ever did. It's not unusual for a film to generate 5 to 8 petabytes of material by the end of the day. And how do you navigate all that stuff? So cloud storage is a great place to put this stuff, but it's not the same as sticking it on a bunch of LTO tapes and hoping for the best, because we still need to find this stuff. And getting back to the reuse archive thing, if we're going to create assets that people are going to reuse, they have to be able to get a hold of them very, very quickly. So we've been doing a lot of examination, a lot of study, and have built some technologies that will allow us to treat media as unstructured data for the first time, because we need to know a lot about it in order to make decisions about it. And yet everything to date has been human curated, especially when it comes to dailies, right? You have an editor sitting there taking notes and picking the best take. But in talking with every editor that's presented with these massive shooting ratios, it's pretty unanimous that the first take that looks like it might work is the one that ends up in the show, because they don't have time to look at all of them, right? So the idea of creating access to this is extremely important. And one of the nice things about working on the cloud archive side at Google is we have the ability to instantly retrieve anything in the archive, because everything we do is on some form of disk media. So there's no wait time for these things. And in a creative world, you don't have time sometimes to wait 2-3 days to get something. You used to, but the world's changed.
And it comes back, may not be the right thing.
Exactly.
Either.
And so we also want to make sure that people are finding the pieces they're looking for within the context of what they're doing, right? So if traditionally, companies have media asset management systems, which means, I call it the altar you go to for all your media, right? You have some general idea of what you want. Somebody might know the search terms to look for, and then you get a bunch of master clips, and then you have to find the sub clips, and then you have to transcode them, and you have to bring them in. I would rather see a model, and we're already implementing this, where an editor sitting, say they're working in Premiere or Avid or whatever, are just searching within the application, and the piece they're looking for, the clip they're looking for, is in the timeline. And then you've eliminated all of that other noise.
We've seen some really great examples of that. Some prototypes, some things that have actually been put into production. So I think that is exactly where we're headed, and I think sooner rather than later, for sure.
Absolutely.
What would you say from an archive perspective in the cloud? Are there any big hurdles or roadblocks that we still have to get over?
There's one interesting roadblock, and this is very specific to the media business, is related to fixity, right? And this is something we talk about a lot on the Digital Media Preservation Committee.
Yeah.
Fixity, for those who aren't aware of it.
We're fixated on fixity.
Exactly. Yeah. It's, I wasn't even familiar with the term until I started talking with archivists, but essentially it's a checksum for every file, right? And again, your checksum for film was visual. You would just look at it and yes, it's okay. There's no vinegar syndrome. There's, everything's good. But once we got to digital, there's a trust exercise we had to go through, which is, okay, I have to qualify that these files are still good. And LTO tape is, it's not the most stable medium in the world, and which is why we tend to migrate after a couple of generations, and that's expensive. But how do you know that those files are still good? So fixity is a checksum that we generate. Most studios do it on the anniversary of whenever a file hits the system. And now some of the studios we've talked to are in the billions of files that they check every year with fixity. And yet, the way cloud works, if you've got something sitting in deep archive that's designed to be there for more than a year in order to keep the costs down, how do you retrieve those things to check a checksum on that? You basically have to retrieve it. There has to be some compute involved. Sure. That doesn't come for free.
No, there's a cost there.
Right? So, but again, it's a trust exercise, and I get it, because I could pick up a piece of film and look at it and it's all good. I can't do that with a digital file. So that the cloud providers still have a ways to go to accommodate that. I mean, yes, we can do fixity, but it's going to come with a cost.
Are there other ways that you're looking at providing the same assurances that what you put in, you can get out?
There are ways that we've been looking at that, because obviously, when we're saving things at the volume we're saving things, we have to do our own security checks on everything just to make sure that things are
because at the end of the
intact.
day, it really doesn't matter how many nines or all that.
Right.
It's got to be what I put in.
Exactly, and that's the thing. And I talk to archivists, for example, who don't want to encrypt their files, right? That opens up an interesting can of worms, because the security and piracy implications are directly related to that encryption. And yet I get it. What if a key is no longer available 50 years from now, and you just have a bunch of files you've been paying to store that are useless because you can't find the key?
Yeah. So we definitely still have some work to do. I want to turn to one of your favorite topics. I know we've been on a couple panels about security.
Sure.
And I know that's something you guys focus on a lot at Google. What do you say to a customer when they ask you if the cloud's secure?
That's a good question, because the simple answer is yes. But so
you just put it in and it's all taken care of?
It's all taken care of. No, it's unfortunately there's a little bit of an education curve sometimes. So it's easy to say yes, it's secure. It's hard to convince sometimes. But what we're noticing now is it's less and less of a concern for people, because they've had experience with even simple things like Google Drive has given people enough confidence that this is secure. They can share it with people. They know that it's, unless you have permission to have it, you're not going to have it. So there is, I think there's a certain level of comfort in this conversation now where we get past having to describe exactly what it means.
I think we focus a lot, specifically on the 2030 vision. We said we need a new approach to security, and we put another white paper out with 6 security principles. And as we move to more of a cloud-centric workflow, we need to move towards a zero trust model. And then we created a specific architecture based on zero trust approach called the Common Security Architecture for Production, or what we call CSAP. I know we referenced some of the things that you guys have been doing, as well as some other places when we were writing that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Beyond Prod, Beyond
Sure.
that whole, I think, was it Beyond Prod, Beyond Corp?
Beyond Corp.
Yeah.
The idea behind Beyond Corp was, traditionally we think of security as locking the building. We might lock the room, and then maybe you have some, biometrics or something on the hard drive, but the file itself is still unencrypted, right? And the way we've entered systems, we have servers that have sensitive information on it at a studio, is still that perimeter approach, right? And we're using VPNs to get in there.
Yeah,
right?
Once you get in,
you get in, but you have free reign to everything, right?
Yeah.
So Beyond Corp, in some ways, was designed to allow for this notion of zero trust, which is a term that came from the late 1990s, of what if we just trusted nothing in the system? How could you then articulate a security protocol for that? And so by articulating security the way we've done in Beyond Corp, it eliminates the need for VPN, for example, because everything is secure. You no longer need this tunnel. And those tunnels have caused problems in the past. You only have so many connections that you can allow.
Yeah.
It tends to slow down those connections. And ultimately, once you're in, you're in. So if somebody is able to crack their way into a VPN,
it's just another door, right?
You're in there. So the notion of having this idea of a secure aspect to everything in the system is important. Now, the other thing that's really important about Beyond Corp is there's a context awareness about security. And this is something that's kind of a concept that it does require some explanation to folks. But let's say, for example, I have a corporate issued laptop and I go to my office. I have access to everything I need, all the corporate systems, all the stuff that would be super proprietary, I have access to on my machine. Now, let's say I take that same machine and on the way home, I'm stuck in traffic, so I stop at Starbucks and I'm going to check my email. Context awareness, which is part of Beyond Corp, knows the circumstances of where I am. So the security protocols are adjusted for where I am. I'm now connecting from a public network. I'm now limited on the number of things I have access to. And let's take it another step. Let's say I'm on my way home. I forgot my laptop at the office, but I need to check my email someplace. So I go to a cyber cafe if they still exist. I'm using a machine I don't own. I might have a security key to get in there, but I'm even further limited on those things I have access to. So it's aware of where it is, where the human is, where the hardware is, and gives us a way to protect everything.
Sure.
And then just, it might feel inconvenient to not have access to certain things, but that's the nature of it. And in this remote world that we live in, we can't guarantee we know where anybody's going to be at any given time. So this idea of locking down everything down at the component level is important. Now, where Beyond Prod comes into play is the implementation. It starts with the code base, right? If you're going to launch a piece of code on a container, there needs to be some way to authenticate where did that piece of code come from? And is that secure code that's been vetted through all the various stages that have to go in before code is submitted? It can't just be pulled from GitHub and you assume everything's good, right? So the Beyond Prod is a series of tools and protocols that allow sandboxing of security and this idea of authenticating code and other things so that at every possible level, when you're accessing a file, you're accessing a website, every stage of it has some authentication in there. Now, the challenge with this always is you want to make sure that there's no impact on productivity, that you're not being asked to log into this or what's the password for this or that. So single sign-on is extremely important, or some initial authentication that then opens this up. And zero trust really allows for that, because if you can solve that problem, then you can eliminate any inefficiencies in the process that could be completely automated under the hood. But it does mean that software developers have to think a little bit differently when they start to containerize. And it does mean that to have a truly zero trust software environment, the applications have to be containerized. Because we do this with billions of users on a number of the applications that we've built at Google over the years, things like YouTube and Google Search and other things. So to be able to scale that means everything has to run in containers, which means that if you're going to establish this level of trust in things, everything has to be containerized to do that. And then you can have these automated processes in there to secure that. And then if a file is left out in the open somehow in an unencrypted bucket, it's impenetrable at that point, because the systems that it talks to or came from all have to be authenticated. And again, it has to be invisible to the user. It should just be seamless.
Yeah, by default, there's no authorization that has to be actually granted.
Right.
It's definitely very well aligned with what we've done in our architecture for production. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about this, and I think you guys actually started even mapping your services to the CSAP architecture. Would you say it's like you can actually start implementing this now?
Yeah. I mean, where we still run into a few little roadblocks is this idea of, one of the components of Beyond Prod is what we call binary authorization, where we're authenticating that code package and its provenance. And so the binary authorization part of that means that the application needs to be containerized. And getting back to the earlier conversation about part of the longer stretch of the journey to 2030 is getting these applications to be containerized, because then we can secure these things. And I don't mean that we secure the application. We're securing all the services within the application.
We look at it as securing the workflow.
Exactly.
Right. Which is
every step
so a little bit different.
Yeah. So until we get to that point, it's hard to establish full zero trust all the way through. But we're working on that at a microcosmic scale to see how much of this system can currently be put in place, knowing that this ISV solution of containerized applications is still a little ways off. But there are a number of steps in there. Again, if we can make that invisible to the user, and this gets back to the whole idea of, you look at the freelance community in Hollywood, and people have relationships with a number of studios because they work on productions everywhere. Right now, they have to have an email address at every single one of those studios and their own authentication systems. So this idea of how do you establish zero trust, and how can we eliminate the need for everybody to have their own different way to authenticate, I think is
we talk
great
about
thing.
This common production user ID.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important. One of the challenges we find with zero trust is it's a series of steps, and let's say there's 30 steps in the process, right? It means you have to tick all 30 boxes. You don't get to pick your favorite 10. And you're not going to go to Best Buy and get Norton Security zero trust software that solves all these problems for you. It's going to have to be a serious examination of the entire workflow process, of the entire human resources side of the process, and even the physical nature of the facilities, to really be able to establish zero trust.
And when we look at the path to implementing CSAP, it starts with zero trust, and then we have different levels of security. It's sort of level 100, 200, 300. It's different functionality that can be introduced to basically turn that knob up, to how secure you want it to be. And it doesn't have to be one size fits all, even for one production. It could be, various parts of it's all based on your risk profile. So various parts of the production might not require the same level of protection as some of the other more sensitive areas. So that's something we really kept in mind, is having scalable architecture for that.
Yeah, and I think that aligns very well with this whole idea of context-aware security, because that's what you're looking at, right? The risk profiles.
Exactly.
And having to define that. Now, who's defining those? That's another whole,
Sure.
It's a new area, right? I mean, how many studios, even 18 months ago, had a chief information security officer, right?
Might be looking forward to that soon, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah. I've just got one more question, maybe in two parts for you.
Sure.
Before we wrap up. So thanks for taking the time, first of all, on talk about the 2030 vision. It's really great to see, the alignment that we have and all the work that you're doing, and actually the progress that we're making. I know we still have a lot of work to do. For those who may not be as familiar with the 2030 vision, what do you think, if you were to boil it down, what do you think is sort of the key thing that they should really pay attention to coming out of that?
Well, I think, one of the things that's always easy to dismiss when you're talking about technology behind making movies is that it's a creative enterprise. And these people, it's a hard thing. I mean, it's just as hard to make a bad movie as it is to make a good one, right? Nobody sets out to make a bad movie. It's hard, and you have to try and create an environment in which people can be creative, but under tremendous pressure. So I think one of the things that isn't articulated specifically in the vision paper, but is this idea that with a single source of truth, with applications and people coming to the data, the efficiency goes up so high that people can just kind of focus back on the creative and not worry about this other side of it, which is a problem right now. I mean, now, if you have a problem in the editing room, you call whoever rented the editing system to you because the coffee pot's not working or something, because they're going to be your tech support, right? So it's a whole different area that needs to be covered. But I think with the vision the way it is, I think what it ultimately does is supports that idea that creatives can do what they do more securely than ever, especially now that they're working in various parts of the world, that these creative enterprises can move forward, still be sensitive to deadlines and security and those things, and not have to worry about any of that stuff. And that's super important.
Anything you can suggest for viewers out there that they should, do to help prepare for this future that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think, one of the big things is security is one of the easiest things for people to implement at this point at certain levels. And that's also the thing that they worry about. I talked to a bunch of editor friends, for example, during the pandemic, both folks who did trailers, folks who did features, and we kind of reestablished a bunch of bad habits just out of necessity, right? We had a deadline to get to, so unencrypted hard drives are being shipped to people via FedEx, and we don't know this, right? But it was happening. And so I think this idea of maintaining a level of security is important. And now that we have chief information security officers that are looking at this, I think security is one of those things that we really can examine now and not impede the process as we get ready. But also, I think with the creatives and these companies, they have a better argument to be made with these software vendors to start moving towards this more secure system, because they're the ones that own the IP at the end of the day, that they're trying to protect it. It's a little harder for cloud providers to have that kind of influence on these ISVs because, again, they own the whole market. Why should they care? And not that they don't care, but I think it's a lower priority because, hey, it's already working. Everybody already uses our tool. Why do we change it? And I think if the studios are in a position to say, hey, we want this to be a more secure workflow, then it helps the whole effort.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I always like to clarify about the 2030 vision is that it's not a prediction of the future. It's what we want the future to be. Yep. And so the more we get alignment around that in the industry, the more we can actually focus on making it happen, and we can all do our parts to achieve that. So thank you again for doing your part.
You're very welcome.
Really
thank
appreciate
you.
it.
I'm a huge fan of what we're doing at MovieLabs here, so thank you for including us.
Thanks for watching the MovieLabs 2030 Vision series. For more information about the MovieLabs 2030 Vision, including additional white papers, videos, blogs, architectures, and specifications, please check out our website at movielabs.com and be sure to subscribe and follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Thanks.